I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is a Fear and Greed extended interview. All the other good bits we couldn't fit into the daily podcast. If you're looking for the daily episode of Fear and Greed, check the podcast playlist. Otherwise, enjoy the interview. Angus Armour is a Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, a community of over 45,000 directors and senior leaders from business, government and the not-for-profit sector. Every 6 months, the AICD surveys its members to create a Directors' Sentiment Index. The latest survey has just been released, and we're pleased that Angus Armour has joined us here to tell us about it. Good morning, Angus.
Good morning, Sean. How are you?
Well, thank you. Tell me, before we get on to the survey, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you end up in this role running the Institute of Company Directors?
Well, it's an interesting question, John. Reflecting on it, the Institute went for a public search to fill the role of Chief Executive. And the first time they called, I said, no, I shouldn't do that, because my predecessor was a very big personality, a former politician and very visible and a great public speaker. And that's not me. And that's what I said. That's not me.
So for those who don't know, that was John Brogden, who was the opposition leader in New South Wales and certainly a big personality.
So they came back a second time. We said, no, you think your background's right. And we spent a bit of time reflecting on it. And I had worked in organizations that had serious governance requirements, and I had worked in a large member organization, been on the board, and I'd worked in the innovation sphere, which was an area that we had a focus. And I'd been working a lot in diversity over decades of my career, and somehow that all seemed to come together. And I thought, I've been a fellow for about 20 years, and I thought, no, actually, I'd love to do this for a while, see if I can make a contribution.
So what does the Institute do? Is it mostly about governance or governance and education?
It is mostly about governance and education. You're exactly right, Sean. 80% of what we do is public or corporate education, and we help people to understand the frameworks they can apply to better govern their organizations to get things done, to achieve their goals. We do member services, we do events, we do public speaking, but most of it's public education.
Okay, you have over 45,000 members from all over the country. Where do they come from?
Actually, all over the world. We are literally all over the country and pretty well distributed based on the economies of each state. So we have large memberships in New South Wales and Victoria, but thriving memberships in the Northern Territories and Tasmania. But we also have members in Asia and North America and parts of Europe.
Okay, and a lot of small business directors and not-for-profit directors?
Indeed. I think one of the issues that I had to address when I joined was the perception that we were sort of an institute of the ASX 200, and we are definitely well engaged with the ASX 200. About 192 of them have one or more AICD members on their boards, but overwhelmingly, our membership is comprised of not-for-profits and small business.
A lot of people running those companies and directors of those companies, it's quite a lonely existence. So you kind of need someone to lean on, and I presume that's really what the Institute does. It allows a community or a network of people doing similar roles to get together and talk about the challenges they've got.
That's right, and that network is very important. It can be a tremendously rewarding experience when it goes well, when you get things done the way you intend. But as we've seen through successive governance failures, it's very challenging when things go poorly.
So let's get on to some of those issues. Leadership and governance during COVID-19. How do you think Australia has performed?
Well, my background is very much global, and I think on any measure, Australia has performed tremendously. Now, we are gifted with being an island nation that helped us to control the spread of COVID-19. And we have, on a global basis, very strong protections for workers and a very strong health system. And that really has given us a tremendous boost to combat this awful pandemic. Obviously with colleagues and friends and family all over the world, they're struggling. I think from an institutional perspective, so when I talk to our members and we get their feedback, it's very divided. So there are people who have been excited and challenged and run into a tremendous opportunity, given the nature of the work that they do. And there are people who've been overwhelmed. And I think particularly of my colleagues in the not-for-profit community who are providing social services, or in the arts community who've been constrained in their ability to perform or to do things in the arts. It's been an overwhelming experience. It's a very divided community, and we need to reach out to both.
Is it times like this where governance comes to the fore?
Absolutely. Particularly if you start, as we did first and foremost, with the health and safety of your staff, of your clients, of your stakeholders, of your members, good governance, having good governance in place before an outbreak like this is really critical, is absolutely critical to addressing it swiftly. The faster you responded to the crisis, the more capable you were of adapting as it unfolded.
Now, you were saying the Institute has a huge education business. How have you guys fared during the past 6 months?
We had a wonderful first 9 months of the year, like many organizations. And then in the last 3 months as an education body, we had to close the doors to face-to-face education. And that was from the perspective of our revenue, our profit and loss, that was quite serious, quite severe. But if I come back to our mission, which is around strengthening society through world-class governance, we moved very swiftly to particularly online webinars around COVID. And we made all those webinars free, not just to members, but to the public generally, about, okay, if you're in a board role, how do you secure the safety of your employees? How do you understand and assess where you are given this environment? How do you start building your way out of it? We started running these webinars. And in the past 6 months, I think we've had about 31,000 registrations, which is just huge.
Wow. Now, you've also just released a Director Sentiment Index. Must be a tough time to be a director. What are they all thinking at the moment?
Well, it's interesting, Sean. From my perspective, I wouldn't say we've turned the corner, but we've turned a corner. So if I look at the overarching numbers you're getting back, you're seeing a greater degree of optimism, a sense that things we have reached. I don't personally, frankly, I can't be certain that we reached the bottom. I think we're midway through a 2-year crisis. But I think with the actions of state and Commonwealth governments, and particularly the budget and all the commentary in the run-up to the budget, there seems to be a floor, at least, that the community feels we've got. And so they're feeling a little more optimistic about our future than they were 6 months ago. They still feel pessimistic in the sense that it's not a growth environment, but they feel better than they did 6 months ago. So that's encouraging.
Okay, and the government support has played a role in that?
Oh, absolutely. JobKeeper is the policy initiative that is certainly featured prominently. I think 40% of the respondents, the directors who responded, said that was the core, that was the key policy initiative that assisted them during COVID-19.
Now, the index, I have followed that index for a while, and I always find it interesting that directors tend to be pessimists. Now, there was a period, I just looked back at it, in 2018, where they became optimistic. But even putting COVID-19 aside, they do tend to be a pessimistic bunch.
We're paid to worry.
That's it, just like that. Now, look, the index does talk about a bunch of other issues that aren't just COVID-19 related, and I wouldn't mind going into a couple of those. Climate change, that's something that's top of mind for many directors.
It is, and it has been for 3 years. So in the 3 years since I've joined the Institute, climate change and energy policy have been competing for the top slot in particularly long-term challenges, but even short-term in some cases. So there's no question that despite our immediate focus on reestablishing economic growth and the momentum in our economy as an immediate issue, directors have not turned their eyes away from some of the long-term challenges around productivity in the economy, climate change, where we should be investing. They remain resolved around what we have to do in the medium long term.
And they're resolved to take action on climate change?
Well, I would infer that from the results. We don't ask that specific question of what each individual firm has done. But if you look at the consistency in their response as climate change is a priority, you could reasonably infer that they're working now. And certainly the directors I'm talking with now, it's baked into their thinking in whatever industry they might be. They are contemplating the role of their organization as a consumer, i.e. the power that they're buying, or in how they go about their business, how they can reduce their footprint.
What about energy policy? Is that a concern for them?
Still very much. For different reasons, obviously, because it is quite, as you observed right at the start, is quite a diverse community. But energy policy, certainty in energy policy is something that the community has been calling for in the 3 years at least that I've been with the AICD.
And I suppose that what falls out of that is it's very difficult to make investment decisions if you don't know where the power's coming from. That's an oversimplification. I get that, but that's the gist of it.
Yep, there's definitely that. That's a very strong message in that result. along with climate change, so an energy policy that allows that transition to a carbon neutral economy. So there are a number of strands in that result. But if I can put it in a positive frame, the support in the director community for a positive and ideally bipartisan approach to energy policy and climate change is definitely there.
Fantastic. Now, one of the big issues in the last 6 months has certainly been Australia's engagement with Asia and particularly China. And we've seen what's happened with some of our big commodities there. What does your sentiment suggest about that?
The first positive remark about China and Asia is the desire to lift our engagement. And I think that's both economic. So if you ask directors where they see the global economy, they say the growth coming in China and parts of Asia. So that's economic. But I think there's a larger conversation happening in our society about how we engage with Asia and particularly with China. And that's translated into these results. You see almost equal parts of the community saying we're either too confrontational with China or we're too accommodating with China, for example. And I think the consequence of that is a very clear message about how we engage with Asia as a nation, being clear what our priorities are and how that translates into our economic relationships.
Okay, and just finally, tax reform, that always seems to be something of interest to directors. Did the index suggest anything around tax reform?
Again, you're absolutely right that tax reform has always been something that has featured in the results. It's typically more about personal taxes and state taxes than corporate taxes,
right.
Which can reflects, again, the diversity in the membership. And it's still an issue, but I think there's also an acknowledgement that in the current environment, where fiscal stimulus is essential to getting us off the mat, then it's probably not going to be the priority that it had been 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay, and the index generally, are most people pulling in the same direction? Is there a difference between men and women, between not-for-profits and private companies? Is there much disparity, I suppose, between the different sectors that are part of the index?
There can be on individual questions. It's a good point to make, actually, that diversity is there. And one of the reasons we're a political, independent body is we represent a very diverse community. I have to start on the basis that every point on the political spectrum is somewhere in my membership, so we don't take political positions. And I think that diversity plays into the results, where particular segments will have an emphasis more than another. But by and large, the big themes, so if you look at the numbers, the really big numbers, they have to be held by quite a considerable majority to feature.
Angus, thank you very much for joining me here on Fear and Greed.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
That was Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, Angus Armour.